All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to unpack a really fascinating and honestly pretty modern theological framework called BioIslam. Now, what is it? At its core, it's a worldview that's trying to connect the dots between scientific discovery and Islamic faith. And before we get too deep, I just want to mention the source material for this is packed with scholarly footnotes. So this isn't just a casual idea, it's backed by some serious academic research. We're going to look at what it believes, the history it's responding to, and where it hopes to lead.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll ask, what even is BioIslam? Then we'll look at the crisis of truth it's trying to solve. After that, we'll dive into this big idea of science as revelation. Then we'll see how it rebuilds the pillars of the faith. And finally, we'll check out its vision for the future.
All right, first section. So, what exactly is BioIslam? Well, you could say it's a pretty provocative mix. It's all about trying to read scripture through the lens of modern science. But, and this is key, it's not just an intellectual exercise. The whole point is to use that new understanding to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face in the world today.
Okay, and this right here, this is the central, and you could say the most disruptive idea in BioIslam. Get this, the thinking isn't that God's revelation is a done deal, something that happened way back in history and then stopped. No. Instead, it's saying that God's self-disclosure is a continuous process. It's always happening. And right now, in our time, the main way that's happening is through science.
And this is really the crucial point. BioIslam isn't meant to be just some abstract philosophy you think about. It's supposed to be a proactive path. That phrase post-Sufi proactivity is really important. Think about it. It takes that Sufi focus on inner spirituality, but it says, okay, that's not enough. It's not just a personal journey. This post-Sufi idea is all about taking science, which it sees as a form of divine revelation, and using it to actively solve real-world problems. So faith isn't just about you and your own salvation, it's about a collective, public effort to make life better for everyone.
Okay, so moving into our next section. To really get what BioIslam is trying to do, you first have to understand the problem it thinks it's solving. And according to the source material, it's a pretty big one. A deep, historical crisis of truth within the global Muslim community, the ummah.
So, the source lays out what it calls the Big Five problems. These are all interconnected, starting with widespread poverty. That poverty, it argues, leads to a brain drain of talented people. And what's driving that? A so-called dark triad of power: authoritarianism, patriarchy, and the politicization of faith. But here's the kicker. BioIslam doesn't just see these as political or social problems. It frames them as symptoms of a much deeper spiritual and intellectual crisis, a crisis that can only be fixed by totally rethinking how faith and the modern world interact. And this timeline really gets to the heart of the historical argument. The source basically claims that truth was the first casualty of the early civil wars, the fitna. You know the saying, history is written by the victors? Well, that's the argument here. The winners of those conflicts shaped the story. This led to the official collection of texts, like the biographies or sirah, and the authenticated hadith or sahih hadith, almost 200 years after the fact. The claim is that what we got was a kind of state-approved imperial Islam that might have twisted the original message. And why does that matter now? Because, from this perspective, the echoes of that old power struggle are still heard today in sectarian conflicts and arguments over who has religious authority.
So, what's the result of this supposed death of truth? According to the source, it means we're living in what's called an al-fatra. It's a theological idea for a time between prophets, an era where there's no clear, direct, undeniable guidance from God. It's basically an age of ambiguity, of waiting. We're all left trying to figure things out for ourselves in a sea of competing historical stories.
And that brings us to the big conceptual pivot that BioIslam makes. So if the historical texts are, let's say, complicated, and we're in this al-fatra, this period of waiting, then where do we look for truth? Where do we find guidance? The answer it gives is, we look to the book of nature itself.
This is where we get to an idea it calls parity of truth, which it borrows from the philosopher Ibn Rushd. It's actually a pretty simple concept. Truth is truth. A spiritual truth can't contradict a scientific truth, and vice versa. If this is the case, then science suddenly becomes a modern form of revelation. And think about what that does. It shifts the authority for interpretation away from the traditional religious scholars, the ulama, and towards pro-science thinkers. You can see how huge this is, right? It basically says to anyone who feels torn between their faith and their scientific education, hey, you don't have to choose. They're two sides of the same coin.
And the source material gets pretty poetic about this. It talks about the divine cosmic light, the Nur as-Samawati, shining through scientists just like it did through the prophets. In this way of thinking, a microscope or a telescope aren't just scientific instruments. They're tools for unveiling God's creation, for discovering truths about our universe that nobody could have even imagined just a few centuries ago.
Okay, so that's the big idea, the philosophy. But how does this actually work in practice? What does it mean for day-to-day faith? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how BioIslam suggests rebuilding the pillars of faith for our modern scientific era.
First things first, it's really important to get this. BioIslam isn't about throwing out tradition completely. Not at all. It actually shares a lot of common ground with mainstream Islam. We're talking core beliefs like the afterlife, a deep reverence for the Quran and the prophets, and even the belief in the return of Isa, or Jesus, the Nuzul Isa. The source also really values the beauty and power of ritual. It talks about the incredible oral joy of Quranic recitation, the Qiraat, calling it a thrilling audio-spiritual universe. So the foundations are still there. Okay, but the differences are huge. First, it makes a big distinction in the Sunnah. It accepts the oral Sunnah, the way prayer and recitation have been passed down through sound for generations. But it's very skeptical of the textual Sunnah, the written Hadith. It also pits traditional legalistic reason against what it calls open reason that's guided by science. And maybe the biggest shift of all is that it pushes back against what it calls the cult of certitude, yaqeen. Instead, it celebrates something called haiba, which is basically the joy of bewilderment. The idea is that standing in awe of the universe's mysteries is a more honest spiritual place to be than claiming you have all the answers.
And this is how they put it all together. It's a three-step method, and it's totally Quran first. Step 1. You use logic to find the core principles directly from the Quran itself. Step 2. You bundle those principles into 5 new inner pillars, things like compassion and justice, to go alongside the traditional 5 outer pillars. And Step 3, and this is the really radical part. Only after you've done all that do you look at other texts, like the Hadith. And you don't use them to create laws, you just use them as literature, as stories that might illustrate the principles you already found in the Quran. You see what this does? It completely flips the traditional way of doing things. It puts the power of interpretation back in the hands of the individual, guided by reason, instead of relying only on ancient clerical rulings.
So let's get to our final section. Where does all of this lead? Well, it builds towards a pretty ambitious, and I'd say very optimistic, vision for the future. And not just for Muslims, but for all of us. So the ultimate goal here on Earth, according to the source for BioIslam, is to help humanity reach what some futurists call a Threshold 9 civilization. So what's that? It's a vision of a highly advanced, super-connected, sustainable global society, one that has figured out how to solve its biggest problems and live in a way that brings together prosperity, peace, and spiritual values.
This is really the end game. It's about using science, but science guided by morality, to finally solve those big 5 problems we talked about. And when you think about all the debates we're having right now about AI and gene editing, about what it even means to be human, this idea of creating theo-humanistic guardrails to guide our technological progress feels incredibly timely. It's about making sure our ethics can keep up with our technology. And all of this happens while, in their belief system, awaiting the prophesied return of Isa/Jesus, the Nuzula Isa.
Which really leaves us with this one big question to chew on. In a world that is constantly changing, where we're discovering new things every single day, what serves faith better? Is it the comfort of having all the answers, of absolute certainty? Or is it the challenge of living with ambiguity? As we've seen, BioIslam, based on the source material, definitely comes down on the side of embracing the struggle, of seeing ambiguity as a path to a stronger faith. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, in our wild and complex world, that joy of bewilderment is a much more profound and honest place to be than the comfort of being certain.